Okay.
Hi, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's our pleasure to host you this week with yet another Geoscience and Geoenergy webinar. Today is 22nd of July. Both Sebastian and myself are delighted and pleased to host our dear colleague Chris Spiers today. Chris wouldn't need my introduction, but still out of courtesy and respect, I'll read a few lines about him. Chris is emeritus professor at the High Pressure and Temperature, or HPT lab at Utrecht University in the Faculty of Geosciences. He led the group as a professor of earth materials until retirement just recently in March 2020, specializing in experimental rock and fault mechanics at crustal and uppermost mantle conditions. His work is hallmarked by a focus on the effects of fluid rock interactions and the microphysics of deformation phenomena. Chris was born and educated in the UK, Sebastian's side of this hosting webinar, gaining his BSc Bachelor Science and PhD from Imperial College London, then became researcher at the University of California at Berkeley until around 82 when he joined Utrecht University to build up and establish the HPT lab. He's the founder of this lab, and so we are so delighted to have him today with us. Chris studies rock deformation across scales, discovers rock behavior in the lab, and models them with mathematical formula and numerical simulations. Among many topics, he has also contributed in understanding rock nonlinear elastoplastic properties and frictional behavior of seismically active faults. He also holds a parallel chair at the China Earthquake Administration's State Key Laboratory of Earthquake Dynamics in Beijing. He has published more than 200 peer-reviewed articles and book contributions. In 2017, he was awarded the European Geoscience Union Yale Medal for his contribution to the field of earth materials and rock physics. It's our true pleasure and honor, Chris, to host you this week in our Geoscience and Geoenergy webinar. Thank you for graciously accepting our invitation. To the audience, please note Chris' lecture would last for about half an hour, 30 minutes. 35 minutes would be okay, Chris, so no pressure. And followed by questions and discussions. Like always, please do type in your questions in the chat box. Sebastian will chair the discussion session like always. Do not wait until the end of the talk. Please do type your questions whenever appropriate, because your question may trigger other questions and other questions and others. And we are looking forward to hosting also a lively discussion session after the talk. Chris, without any further ado, please, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, Hadi. It's an honor and pleasure to be invited again to join this series. I hope I can live up to my reputation. Thank you very much. Rock salt. Rock salt is a fascinating material and a very unusual rock material because it deforms plastically at very, very shallow levels in the Earth's crust, even in your hand in the lab, which I'll show you shortly. This plastic behavior means that it has wonderful sealing properties. It is a fantastic sealing material and has very great importance as a result in geoengineering context, as well as understanding natural salt tectonic flow. I'm going to talk about how it all works at the microscopic level. It is work that I did since I very first came to Utrecht, together with very close colleagues, people like Janos Urai and Colin Peach, and in more Hans de Bresser in more recent years, colleagues such as Suzanne Hanks and Andre Niemeyer and others. Why is rock salt so important? Because first of all, solution mining. And if you mine salt by solution mining, you create cavities which converge, and of course you get subsidence. It can be used, salt cavities can be used for storing oil and gas, a very important application. And now very, very much in the window is storage of renewable energy, hydrogen, green hydrogen, compressed air energy storage, and so on. For many, many years, salt has been under consideration for storing radioactive waste in conventional mines and boreholes. Of course, it has a tremendously important role in trapping oil and gas in geological, in sedimentary systems. And when you drill through rock salt, because it is so plastic and very mobile, very often you have to deal with wellbore damage, wellbore deformation scenarios, and things like this. And there's also a great deal of interest now in whether wellbores can self-seal if you pull out the string. So salt is important with lots of applications. Huge caverns can be made. This is one in the Netherlands. The Netherlands has the deepest solution mining cavities in the world at a depth of around 3 kilometers up here. And, you know, they're big enough to put the Eiffel Tower in, pretty much. So, you know, you can put a lot of stuff in there. Of course, if you're going to do that, you need to model the geomechanical behavior of a system like this. And this is where we have in Utrecht quite a close connection with Hadi's group in Delft that do the numerical modeling, and we're getting together to sort of provide input on material behavior. Okay, so of course, if you're going to model something like the convergence of these large cavities, subsidence at the surface, and so on, then you need constitutive laws. You need creep laws. The most important, which I'm going to focus on today, are steady state creep laws. You need them to understand the short-term plastic convergence of cavities under overburden pressure, mines as well, of course. So you need creep laws. They're absolutely essential. You also need damage and permeability laws to understand how the integrity of these things may change, especially if they're near the edge of the salt. And I very, very strongly believe that you need a real physics basis to understand this, because you're often dealing with extrapolating lab data, which you get in experiments of a few days or weeks, or maybe months or years duration, okay? You have to extrapolate those things over very long time periods, decades, hundreds of years. In the case of radioactive waste disposal, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. So understanding the physical basis, the processes, is absolutely crucial in my opinion. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So you can very quickly appreciate the importance of understanding all these processes by looking at something like a solution mine cavity, in which one might want to store hydrogen or gas or something. Let's say the pressure in here is a little lower than lithostatic. You will get convergence. The salt will converge, cavity will start to close by creep. The mean stress is low at the wall, so there'll be dilatation, microcracking. Under those conditions, it's a little bit sort of semi-brittle, okay? So you'll get damage around the wall, permeability will increase in this region. If there's fluid in there, for example, at the bottom, or if this is damp, this will go in. You'll get interactions between the soluble salt and the maybe damp air or hydrogen going in there. That will produce all sorts of other effects, all sorts of coupled effects, which will also influence the behavior of this material further. So you get a very complex coupled feedback loops. You can. It may not be important. You need to know whether they're going to be important. Okay, so it's very plastic. And let's start looking now then at these microphysical processes. Here's a nice picture. It's beautiful stuff. I absolutely love it. Look at it. It's really lovely crystalline materials. Here's a scale bar. If you make a thin section of rock salt, you can see the nice crystalline grains. Well, they're really big, typically about around 5 millimeters, very commonly in natural salt. And the most striking thing about this material is that the individual grains can deform crystal plastic processes. Here you see some single crystals of salt that have been formed in the lab, unconfined by students in Utrecht. and you see dislocations, slip lines on the surface. So if crystal plastic deformation occurs within the crystalline grains by motion of dislocations, edge and screw dislocations. Here's a lovely example. This is me some, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, actually squeezing and bending a single crystal of salt between my fingers. You can do it if you know how. Questions can be answered later. Okay, it's a wonderful demonstration. You can do it with your bare hands, even me. All right, now, so crystal plastic flow, dislocation flow laws, dislocation creep laws, if you like. There is a vast, vast amount of work done on this for of course, for modeling all these important applications. Huge amount of work by many, many different authors. And here's some typical data. This is the log of the stress applied to the material, and this is minus the log of the strain rate, so it's getting slower this way. All right. Now, typical laboratory experiments are going to fall in this kind of range. This is already very slow laboratory rates, 10 to the minus 9 per second. This is around 10 to the minus 6. Here are typical data from many different studies at this kind of temperature range, of typical sort of temperatures at a few kilometers in the crust. And that's all. This can be described very accurately with all sorts of empirical laws, and very typically a Norton type power law with an N value of around 5 will fit salt data, creep data very, very well when dislocation creep is going on. There is a bit of a very noticeable problem for somebody who's familiar with salt in its geological environment, and that is that if you extrapolate this lab data, then it does not explain flow rates that you can see in nature, or in borehole closure rates, for example, or in borehole deformation shearing rates, which can be as high as 10 to the minus 11, or perhaps 1 or 2 orders of magnitude lower. Extrapolating this doesn't really explain the behavior of salt in nature. And so there must be either these laws are not that simple, and there is some sort of maybe the mechanism is the same, but the actual physical basis for such behavior would require a function like this to fit the data, or there must be a different process down here. Well, let's look at the process of dislocation creep for a start. We can model this, and it has been done by many, many different authors, as some of them mentioned down here. We can make dislocation scale dynamic models for the motion of dislocations through the crystal lattice and how that is controlled, how the rate is controlled by processes such as dislocations climbing over other dislocations which might act as barriers and so on. This is what actually controls the speed of the process. Okay? It can be a process called climb, in which dislocations can move up through the lattice, get past obstacles, untangle themselves. The speed of these, of the motion of these dislocations by these different processes controls the creep rate. And you can derive theoretical models for that. And many people, here's one of these, interestingly, work done by Hans de Bresser and Nawaz Mohammed at our lab. In theory, these things should be dependent on the confining pressure, purely due to the effect of pressure on the structure of the dislocations. This gives a way to find out if this process is actually operating. But other mechanisms can control the rate. Climb can control it, that's this one. This flow law, strain rate, exponential dependence here on this pressure. This is the stress raised to the power n. This is where this is typically 3, 4, or 5, okay, and you see that in salt. It can also control the process, or another process called cross slip. When you have screw dislocations as the dominant type of microscale phenomenon going on in the crystal, motion of these things. They don't climb, they can slip into different glide planes. And if indeed this process of jumping onto different glide planes controls the rate of movement of dislocations, you can also derive microphysical laws for this, okay, based on the dynamics of motion of dislocations under stress. And this is the result that you get for this type of process, and you see an exponential dependence on stress here. So much, much more stress sensitive. So if you to express this as a power law, you have 2 here plus a huge stress sensitivity here. You typically get a power law fit of something with an n value of something like 7 or 8 or 9 to something like this. And interestingly, this is also dependent on pressure, but the material becomes weaker with increasing pressure, or there's no effect. Whereas if this climb process is involved, different microphysical mechanism, the material becomes stronger at higher pressures. So by doing experiments at different pressures, you could actually differentiate which are the actual processes controlling plastic flow and creep. And that is actually something that we did at our lab some years ago. Nawaz Muhammad did this in his PhD. Here are some results from constant strain rate experiments, okay? So these are done, for example, at room temperature. This is done, these are room temperature. This is at typically, this is the highest temperature we investigated, 250 degrees. You already see the effect at 200. Look at this. Stress strain curve, okay? Here you see the blue curve and the red curve. The red curve is 50 MPa confining pressure, mean stress, yeah? Initial mean stress, 50 MPa confining pressure. The next one is 600 MPa confining pressure. That's nearly down in the mantle, which is not realistic. But what you see is the effect of pressure on stress is very small here. At higher temperatures, 50 MPa confining pressure, 600 MPa, and you see there's a much bigger effect. And this actually fits with these models that I just discussed. And what you see here is low temperature. What we found is that at low temperature, fast deformation, there's not much effect of confining pressure. That supports models, microphysical models that rely on glide being the operative mechanism. The difficult stage in movement of dislocations is breaking the bonds as the dislocations move through the lattice. Higher temperatures, there is a pressure effect. The higher the pressure, the stronger the material. And this is consistent with a model, a power law creep model. The power law creep model, which is controlled by the climb motion of edge dislocation, which is a diffusive process. So this is a sort of bond-breaking controlled process. This is a diffusive controlled process. So we definitely see evidence for different processes glide at the lower temperatures of fast deformation and climb, controlling the rate of creep at higher temperatures or much lower strain rates, like you'd expect in slow deformation around cavities in the long term or in nature. Okay. The interesting thing is, this is also reflected in the microscopic structure of the salt. You can see evidence of this. Here it is, look. So let's go back. This is low temperature fast, high temperature slow. And what you see is in low temperature fast, you see these bands. These are, to cut a long story short, these are bands where dislocations have moved through the crystal, consistent with the concept of glide controlled deformation. So low temperature deformation of salt fast involves an important component of glide. Much slower deformation, for example, at rates, when you're thinking of strains occurring on tens, hundreds of thousands of years, or geological timescales, higher temperatures, you get this totally different internal structure within the grains. Look at the difference. Here you see these little cells or subgrains developed. This is absolutely characteristic of dislocation climb. So it's completely consistent with our mechanical data. So what does this tell us? It tells us that under during deformation at pretty low strain rates, around things like cavities or in natural deformation of salt, you would expect climb to be the main mechanism of crystal plastic flow, dislocation flow. And right up against cavity walls where the stresses are very high, deformated fast, you might expect this. This is what you expect to be dominant. All right, so how does that help us? Well, what it helps us in this sense. It means that we have a theoretical basis, a mechanistic basis to fit a particular functional form to this data, okay, which indeed is this power law form. There's a stress dependency here, but that's not important for the upper crust, okay? It's only important for identifying the mechanism. So we can derive a mechanistic basis for this type of equation, and with an n value of around 5, you can be pretty sure that you could extrapolate this data to very low strain rates where we see evidence for this kind of process. I'll show you in a moment, right? So we have a physical basis for this. It's a power law type of behavior. Maybe this value changes. There are several different sub-mechanisms. Basically, though, one is going to expect to be able to extrapolate something like this from lab to engineering conditions and to nature. That still doesn't explain the strain rates that we actually see in a naturally formed salt. So, okay, we have a good description here, but we still are not really getting down to these very low strain rates and very low stresses. We're talking about stresses perhaps below around 5 MPa or something like that, deviatory stresses. So what does control creep at these low stresses then? Let's go back to nature and actually look at the microscopic structure of some natural salt. This is from Avery Island in the United States. This is deformed naturally, a natural salt tectonic flow, low stresses of a few MPa. Look inside the grains and you see these subgrains. This is evidence of climb-controlled dislocation creep. Using another technique, which Janos Urai pioneered and we did much work on together, by irradiating salt, you can decorate, you deposit sodium on the dislocation structures, and again you see subgrain structures here, but it reveals something else that you don't see in a normal optical microscope or SEM. You see crystal overgrowth. And what you're seeing here then is not only evidence for dislocation creep with climb control and subgrains, you're seeing overgrowth. It's evidence for dissolution and reprecipitation in the form of crystal growth. So something is going on here with dissolution and reprecipitation. And that is really not that surprising, at least I felt not. But this has been extremely controversial in the literature because there is a widespread belief in the engineering community that salt is not soluble in a saturated solution, which is in fact quite wrong. But how does it, what do we actually see in natural salt? They contain water. All natural salt contains grain boundary brine inclusions and films between the crystals. Okay, so creep by a process such as stress-driven dissolution at high stress boundaries and diffusion and precipitation should be possible. Dissolved material here, precipitated there. That ought to be possible. And I did a lot of work on the theory of this when I started my career. Indeed, if you apply a stress, this is a crystal inside such a salt rock, then you increase the solubility of these stressed interfaces. Let's say this is the maximum principal compressive stress, this is a minimum. You increase the solubility here relative to here, and so matter dissolves through in these fluid films and channels and so on, and it will diffuse and precipitate at these sites. So you get shortening due to mass transport around the grain and then extension in the horizontal direction. And you can derive from thermodynamics and kinetics a creep off of that. Of course, the faster it dissolves and precipitates, the faster the stuff creeps. And it takes this form where the strain rate is linearly related to the stress, inversely related to the cube of the grain size, and this stuff here, DCS, is describe the diffusive properties, the ease of diffusion in grain boundary fluids. Okay, and you only need a few tens of ppm of adsorbed water to get this effect, in theory. So this is all theory. This mechanism should operate. Now, the very first experimental evidence we found for this was in really years ago. It's only 35 years ago. 1986, Janos Urai and I, we did experiments on fine-grained salt. Why did we do that? We did that because, look, our theory predicted a very strong dependence on the crystal site. So natural salt crystals are huge. Natural rock salt has very coarse crystals. This will be slow. But what could we do then to see it? We made fine artificial salt with a very fine grain size, and we did creep tests. This is log stress against minus log strain rate. So this is fast lab strain rates. This is slow lab strain rates. And these were samples with different grain size. This is very fine, deformed faster. This is a little coarser, deformed more slowly. What do you see here? The slope of this data, look, is 1 in this log stress, log strain rate plot. So that means there's a linear relation between stress and strain rate. So indeed, our results showed linear relation. The strain rate was linearly related to stress and definitely dependent on grain size, fine, coarse, same temperature, but we couldn't constrain very well the sensitivity. So what did we do? We started doing compaction experiments where we could control the grain size very well. And we developed a theory for the rate of pressure solution in a granular material. It contains, it's exactly the same, but it contains here porosity-dependent term. So the strain rate depends on the applied stress linearly on the grain size cubed down here. And there's a porosity-dependent term. We did experiments, and yes, we found very clear evidence. This is strain rate, log strain rate, okay, against log grain size. And we found that the coarser the grain size, between about 100 and about 300 microns, the coarser the grain size, the slower the strain rate. And the slope, look, it was about -3, tells us an inverse cubic dependence of strain rate on grain size. And for samples measured at different fixed values of porosity, 4%, 10%, 20%. You see a very nearly inverse cubic dependence of creep rate on grain size. So this really started to confirm what's going on. If you look, we looked at the microstructure, which is a key part of a microphysical approach. And what did we see in this granular salt that we compacted? Indentations of grains into each other and overgrowths where material precipitated in the pores. Here they are, like absolutely certain evidence for this process of pressure solution, stress-driven dissolution and reprecipitation. And we were able to, we compared our results with our models, and the fit was extremely good. We got a very, very close correspondence with this theoretical law, strain rate linearly proportional to stress, inversely proportional to grain size. Fitting the data to fitting the model to the data allowed us to quantify this grain boundary property. This is the rate of diffusion in the grain boundaries. We could measure it, we could quantify it, we could quantify the temperature dependence, and we were able to observe that the grain boundaries were definitely coated with fluids in various kinds of experiments. We used that compaction data to predict the behavior of dense salt. Okay, so this was for granular salt, porous. We used the theory to convert, to apply these parameters determined from compaction in creep experiments on dense salt. And we compared it with the original experimental data we had. This was our experimental data for fine salt, and the gray bars are actually the predictions from the compaction experiments. So we got very, very good agreement indeed, and quite high confidence in the values of the parameters in this equation describing the process. But of course, the key thing here is, look, this was all very fine salt. We could see creep by this mechanism at lab strain rates around 10 to the minus 8, 0.2 of a millimeter grain size salt. So if you go to 2 millimeters, it's already 1,000 times slower. So you can immediately see, to measure this process in a lab experiment on natural salt with a grain size of several millimeters is not going to be possible, or is going to stretch the absolute limits of time. So coming back to the problem then, here's our dislocation creep behavior, which we have a good microphysical basis and lots and lots of data and constitutive laws, and our pressure solution law that I just described, how we got that for fine-grained salt. If we extrapolate that grain size to natural salt grain sizes of a few millimeters, it falls down here. It's in this band, right? We're looking at slopes in this band. You see, then it does actually offer an explanation for the relatively rapid creep one sees in natural salt compared with what you'd expect extrapolating dislocation creep. So it's quite, I have always felt this is quite convincing that it really is very likely to be this transition at low stresses. And the very, very latest experimental data by people that I have enormous respect for. So a group at the IFG in Germany, Pierre Berest's group at the École de Mines and École Polytechnique, they have done experiments lasting years, creep experiments lasting years, and the results have just started to come out in 2008, 2019. And what do you see? Indeed, this is creep rate a day here against log of the stress. Yeah, log creep rate, log of the applied stress. And what do you see? You see that at high stresses, this type of behavior here has slope in this graph of about 5. This is dislocation creep type of behavior. But when you get down to these very low stresses, so this would be stresses of perhaps about 4 MPa and less, when you get down here, down to strain rates which are very, very slow, to 10 to the minus 5 per day, that's 10 to the minus 12 or something per second, right? Then they actually obtain data down here, and you see a switch to this linear behavior. And here are the predictions from our pressure solution model derived from fine-grained experiments. So we measured the data up here. These are our data here, and extrapolate that using a theoretical law to a grain size of 5 millimeters and 1 millimeter, and you see it's definitely in the right order of magnitude for the behavior observed in these incredibly long-term creep experiments by these guys. So, of course, we were very, very pleased to see these experimental results on natural salt with this coarse grain size coming pretty close to what we predicted. So linear creep was confirmed at low stresses. The rates are very similar to pressure solution. Not everyone believes that that is the mechanism, but I do. So, for engineering purposes, which is really very important, There are now lots of constitutive models emerging from IFG, Sandia Labs in the United States, BGR in Germany, TNO here in the Netherlands, models which essentially, constitutive models which describe this behavior. They're not necessarily based on the microphysics, they may be just fits to the data, but they are coming into the picture and should be used in numerical modeling. TNO has done this for some years, actually. I've been in front on that, but very few others have used it. These are the processes we believe are going on. So is that the end of the story? It ought to be according to the time, but it's not. So Hadi, you have to stop me if I go on too long. I want to try and briefly skim through. Is that okay?
Yeah, please go ahead for 5 more minutes at least.
All right. So that's not the end of the story. There are other important effects that are insufficiently quantified for modern standards. What do I mean by that? I mean, now the demands of regulators are such that it's not good enough to have a creep law or some sort of permeability or damage law that gives you a rough order of magnitude sort of. You actually need it to be much better. So there are many, many things which in the past would have been interesting phenomena that you wouldn't bother to account for. They probably do need to be accounted for. There's a process called fluid-assisted grain boundary migration, which I'll show you a few pictures of. These grain boundaries with brine or water in them, they can heal, and that changes the picture totally. Microcracking, damage going on in the walls of a cavern or cavity, for example. These permeability development, but they can also heal. It's wholly understood in the longer term. Effects of how this microcracking actually interplays with this transport of stuff around grain boundaries. It's very poorly understood. We don't know what the effects of load cycling are and fluids coming in and out of the wall material. How far will it go? What effects will it be? And something is very important. It's not the end of the story because the vast majority of engineering studies at the moment still just use a power law description for the flow of salt. And we know now that that is definitely not adequate for stresses below probably about 4 MPa. So we need more microphysics to understand these processes where there is sensitivity to them in numerical models. That's also very important. So here's just a few quick shots to give you some idea of what can happen in there. As well as pressure solution, you can get transport not just around crystal boundaries, but across them. This is salt deformed dry, and you see the original grains there. They're all happy doing nothing. There's been no pressure solution, no activity of fluid. There's very little water. This is dislocation creep behavior. But under otherwise, this is actually different conditions, but under the same conditions, if it's wet, you only need 20, 30 ppm, 40 ppm of water. This is exactly the same material. It's microstructure totally changed by new crystals growing. That happens because fluid in these thin films acts as a medium through which deformed grains dissolve, and then the material precipitates on the other side, so the boundaries grow, so new strain-free crystals grow. This changes the microstructure, but also affects the mechanical behavior, so we need to know the conditions under which it occurs. Look at this. This is a dry material, stress strain curve, constant strain rate experiment, elevated pressures, no dilatancy. This is the stress strain curve for dry material. If you have just a few, maybe 10, 20 ppm water present, the flow strength is reduced by a factor of 2 because of this recrystallization effect. How does that figure in the log stress, log strain rate plot? Okay, this is now put the other way around. These are high strain rates, these are low strain rates. Here's the dislocation creep behavior. This is mostly where this recrystallization occurs in this regime with N is about 5. Probably it goes on alongside dislocation creep, affecting the flow strength maybe a factor 2. Once you get down here, you get into this pressure solution, linear creep regime. What a surprise, you dry this stuff, and N changes from 5 to 7.5 straight away. Okay, so there's all sorts of interesting and complex stuff there. If you go to low enough stress, these fluid films start doing weird things because they start actually breaking up due to the effects of surface energy. Surface tension becomes strong enough compared with low stresses to break up the fluid films. It stops pressure solution. It stops this recrystallization process. But we don't know at what stress it is. What is that stress level? 0.1 MPa, 1 MPa, we don't know. It has a huge effect on numerical modeling results, and the team at TNO have recently shown this. This is a really very important effect for real effects in numerical modeling. Besides all that, there's the additional complication if you look at a field of differential stress and confining pressure. So low differential stress is deviatoric stress, high confining pressures, you do not get dilatancy, and you get dislocation, creep, you get recrystallization, you get pressure solution. We can describe this behavior pretty well. But if you start increasing the stress, you get into the regime where the latency occurs and the microstructure starts cracking up. You get microcracks, damage. You get porosity and permeability development. The material becomes permeable, it becomes weakened by the damage, and there's all sorts of very interesting and important questions here. So what are the effects of stress cycling? For example, in a hydrogen storage cavern wall, what are the effects of stress cycling on the position of this boundary? Does it go up, down? What does it do? What happens if you get fluid permeating into the porous cracked material? How far will it go? How much will it change the properties? And these things have not been answered with any mechanistic basis. So again, microphysics is needed to constrain extrapolation of what we measure in the lab to longer term, or let's say multi-cyclic behavior for a hydrogen storage cavern, something like that. Where was I? Okay, so I've reached my conclusions. Linear creep definitely occurs in rock salt. This linear viscous creep by pressure solution, it definitely occurs in rock salt low stress. That is now clearly demonstrated. And I think more and more people believe that it is indeed by this mechanism of pressure solution, which I'm pleased to say to those that have doubted it, we actually predicted, myself, Janos Urai, and a number of other people, we predicted this effect 35 years ago, and now it has been measured in real natural rock salt under confined conditions by the fantastic work at the Institute of IFG in Leipzig in Germany. It was wonderful work. And in the École de Mines in France, called Polytechnique, Pierre Barres, people did fantastic work. This linear low stress creep is people are starting to incorporate it in engineering constitutive models. It, is shown in recent modeling work this is essential because it has a big effect, but there are many other aspects that need attention. Understanding this recrystallization process, will that have an effect in the deformation field around cavities and caverns? That's a very important unknown. What happens at what stresses do these grain boundaries heal, and these fluid assisted effects and the linear creep and so on? What do they, at what stresses do they stop working? How does this dilatancy and damage and microfracture, permeability development, how does that really work, for example, during stress cycling over very long periods, and what coupled effects are going on? To be able to extrapolate lab data beyond the lab, we need microphysical quantification, and we most definitely need to explore this issue of load cycling, because that is really crucial for energy storage for the future. That concludes my talk.
Thank you very much, Chris. We are trying to find a way again out of being so absorbed to this story. You said we again didn't notice time was up, but yeah, Thanks very much.
You're all hard, Paddy. Thank you.
Try to find my mouse to unmute myself even. So great talk. Thanks a lot. I see already plenty questions posted, so I hand it over to Sebastian, please, for questions.
Yes, thank you, Chris, for a really nice talk also from my side. Yeah, plenty of questions that are coming through from some of our old friends and listeners. So Yuang kicked off the first question, says, thanks for the interesting talk. How would heterogeneity impact the entire cavern's time-dependent creep and viscoplasticity?
That is a very important question indeed, and a question that often comes up in the engineering community because, of course, real rock salt is tremendously heterogeneous. Even if it's pretty pure halite, you have huge differences in grain size and so on in different parts of the salt body and around a cavern. And the other point is that you may have different layers in there, like rigid layers like anhydrite, or very weak, rapidly creeping salts like layers of dischovite or carnotite. So these are two aspects of heterogeneity that are very important. Very often, because grain size is so variable, engineers feel, well, we can't take that into account. You can never get it done. I don't think that's true. If a log of a borehole taken in salt when you make a cavern, or when you didn't make a cavern, with modern scanning techniques, you can very quickly characterize the grain size over a large volume of material. And it can be accounted for, in my belief, quite well. Knowing about other heterogeneities is a more tricky problem, but I think very, very important, because if you have, you can have extremely fine layers of salt, which can lead to a localization of deformation. That can be good, that can be less favorable. This is a very, very important issue and will need to be considered increasingly in future.
Thank you.
May I ask if Chris sees us? Do you see us, Chris?
No, I don't. I'm not sure why.
If you click
How about now?
share...
Sorry,
yeah.
Just unshare the screen.
Shall I end my show?
Yeah, if you
yes.
browse your Chrome browser,
then I have to somehow go back to this, and okay, so I do that and I stop sharing, and now I see you boys.
Fantastic. Now it has better chemistry, hopefully. So
yeah, I know it's horrible. Otherwise, you're talking. One is talking to a black hole.
Yeah, you may not enjoy seeing us, but it's not too bad.
No, it's good to know when I'm getting boring. So that's fine.
Never. David Brun asked a question. He mentioned of the grain sizes, and he asked, how do you know your grain size is constant? You would normally expect grain growth, recrystallization, etc.
A fantastic question, David, from a man of experience. You're absolutely right. So during plastic deformation of rock salt, under conditions where this fluid-assisted recrystallization can operate, then it starts and it gradually consumes the microstructure and will lead to a new grain size, which ends up more or less in the transition between dislocation creep and pressure solution. And it gives rise to a relationship between the recrystallized grain size and stress. That's what you see in experiments. Now, the strains needed to get into that regime where the grain size adjusts itself really significantly are very large. So at least 20%. So a very important question in cavern modeling, for example, in cavity modeling closure, is how large a volume of the salt actually undergoes strains that are that big. And if those volumes are large, then this also has to be taken into account. The readjustment of grain size Hans de Bress has done a lot of work on that, as I think David himself has worked on that too. So this would be important where you have very large deformation, but for pretty small deformations, which most of the strains around a salt cavern are fairly small, over a very large volume, right? Then it may not be as important as one might think or as one sees in experiments.
Thank you. Coming back to the experimental side, and I should have probably brought that question as a follow-up from Johan's immediately. So Johan also asked, could you characterize the impacts of heterogeneity in plastic rock salt deformation in the lab? So could we do, is it technically possible to have, say, composite cores that you deform?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. So you ought to come and visit us, Johan. It's been talking since I retired. I've been getting back into salt, which is so lovely, right? And I've been chatting with Janos Urai and other people if we might try things like this. Yes, we have seen effects like that. If you deform a coarse salt sample or which has got finer layers, you do see that they deform preferentially. So yes, you can do something on this in the lab, and of course, you can do upscaling kind of models with numerically or with homogenization theories and so on to try to account for this. So I'm very interested in working with people who want to do that, like Hadi.
Okay.
With pleasure, of course.
Leila asks, so it's a somewhat longer question. I'm going to read it out step by step. So Leila says, thank you for the great talk. Given the model with some parameters to fit to get the plastic deformation of the rock salt, are the plastic properties, i.e. the parameters of the model, are they constant or do they change over the time, i.e. over the duration of hydrogen storage operation? Do we need to assume over many years of operation that the plastic properties may change, for example, specifically due to active chemistry of the fluids and rock salt in the cavern?
So very, very good question, Leila. This is actually quite closely related to the question by David Brun. So as deformation proceeds, if large enough deformations are reached, then the microscopic structure of the material changes because of new crystals growing or maybe microcracks appearing. And this does change the behavior of the salt. So because the salt is creeping, then these things which largely depend on strain and to some extent the deviatoric stress, they become apparent with the passage of time. So yes, there are changes in these properties of time. There are all kinds of effects of the stress magnitude as well. So for example, around a cavity, the stresses are very high near the walls. But if the further away you go, the lower the stress is. So near the cavity walls, all this dislocation stuff will be very important. Far away from the cavity, this linear creep, low stress linear creep will be important. And that distance will change as time goes on. So to take those effects into account is really very difficult, but without some sort of physical understanding, of course, you have no chance because you can't possibly extrapolate from lab data in that sense. Also, there will be effects with fluids penetrating. There's a great controversy at the moment, also here in the Netherlands, about the long-term abandonment of a salt cavern. If you have a salt cavern filled with brine and you close it and leave it, what happens? It converges, it pressurizes the fluid. The fluid will ultimately reach lithostatic pressure at the top and exceed it even slightly, and it may penetrate the salt and it may change its properties. So there are a lot of very complex coupled processes. I'm not suggesting that we can solve all those things, but I do think some of these things are important enough to need attention.
Yeah, so I'm just going to interject you with question or comment myself. Coming from the modeling side and the uncertainty quantification side, you need the right constitutive models given all the other things we don't know. You said stress distribution is getting closer to the current, further away. Temperature, if you inject hydrogen cyclically, and you may be cooling, heating up the cavern. There are lots of things we already don't know if we then don't have the reliable constitutive models. I think
that is exactly right. So, one cannot take into account all these effects. So sensitivity analysis in numerical models is very, very important, because you guys can tell us, we can tell you guys, okay, this might happen, investigate how sensitive it is. If it's not sensitive, it doesn't matter, right? And it might be interesting, but it doesn't matter for the purpose. And it's very important to know, what do we not have to consider?
Yeah, I agree. Going back to our audience, there are two questions are very much the same. And Milad Naderlu asked the question, and also Kishan Kumar in a very similar way. Milad said, great talk, Chris. Since most of the constitutive models are either too optimistic or too conservative, do we need constitutive model for long-term predictions? And Kishan essentially asked the same question. Can we employ the short scale lap times, the results from the short lap time scales to predict the long-term behaviors? Do we need other models for longer term behavior?
Yes, we do. So for this longer term behavior, it's now very, very clear, in particular from some of the numerical modeling work that TNO has done, it's very clear that you have to include this transition from this power law behavior to linear behavior at low stress to get realistic predictions for long term. For short term, near field behavior, near the cavity or borehole, you don't need it. But for long-term, long-range effects, it's absolutely essential. So very good question from both of the two, who I know quite well, of course, Milad and Kishan. Thank you, boys.
So Milad has a follow-up question. I think you've answered this, but I'm just going to read it out anyway, in case you want to add something. So many believe we know a lot already about rock salt. So why do we need more research for hydrogen storage and caverns? Is it because of the long-term operation of storage, injection, and depletion processes?
Yes, it is. So, of course, from an engineering perspective, all of these horrible effects that I've been describing are an absolute nightmare, right? If it's the last thing you want an engineer wants a nice constitutive law that he can use and that is going to capture all the main effects. And I agree with that totally. But if it stops working because, of long timescales, so then we got to think a bit more carefully. So for hydrogen storage, there've been, excuse me, there's been relatively little work, a little bit, some wonderful work done by a young Chinese postdoc, Ji Hui Ding, who worked at Texas A&M University. He might even be online. Fantastic work he's done on effects of confining stress and effective stress on deformation of salt and on cyclic loading. And but by and large, this has not been investigated much, and we don't know what the effects will be really. So that certainly needs an investigation. You cannot be sure that existing constitutive laws can simply be applied reliably. More important still is that damage laws, you're reversing the state of stress and deformation in the material, you're probably going to cause fatigue, cracking of some form or other. Hydrogen will penetrate. You'll have very complex coupled transport deformation behavior. I think I'm damn sure that you guys can model that. But it's a complex coupling between deformation, permeability development, gas penetration, influencing the mechanical properties, and so on. Okay, the hydrogen can if it goes in and out of the salt, it can dry the salt. And that changes its behavior. So there are lots of unknowns. From a practical point of view, I certainly hope that some of these will not be important, but some of them might be, and we need to find out.
I'll take one more question from David Brun, and then I close with some really nice comments from the audience. David asks, at depth in a heterogeneous rock volume, because we talked about heterogeneity, at a heterogeneous rock volume and at long time scales, strains could be quite large if they're localized, for example, in shear zones, which you'd expect in a heterogeneous material. How do you predict that on the basis of lab data?
Yeah. This is a very important point. If you imagine a real salt structure, let's say something like a solution mine cavern, which you've used to make salt, produce salt, and then maybe you store hydrogen in it, and then you're 100 years down track or something, or 50 years down track, and you think, oh, I have to close this now, fill it up with brine, close it. What is going to happen? Well, it will pressurize itself. The fluid will come out sooner or later. It might take geological timescales, but it's gravitationally unstable. It's going to come out eventually. How long could very well be determined by things like shear localization on heterogeneities. You have weak layers in there, strong layers in there, which could very well localize deformation. And for this very long term abandonment problem, this is an absolutely key question and has not been addressed. Several people have called for it to be addressed. It needs to be addressed in future.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to close with comment from the audience. Heinz's fantastic talk, Chris. Many thanks. A very relevant talk for the energy transition. Similarly, Leslie, thank you very much for the great talk. It's very illustrative, especially in the current context of energy transition. And also, our time is up. Thank you very much from my side for yet again a great talk, Chris. It was lovely to have you back in that webinar. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your patience, and thanks to all those who made those nice comments. You're always welcome to come and chat with me.
Of course.
Thank you.
Okay,
Hadi,
thanks.
over to you.
Yes, thanks very much. And I'd like to just take the chance to introduce our next week's speaker. Is going to be Dr. Alexander Richter he's the founder of Think Geoenergy. Alex is going to talk about geothermal energy's transformative role in the global energy transition. Until next week, most importantly, stay happy and healthy, and also tuned in to our channel. We see you all again next week, 4 p.m. Central European time, 3 p.m. British time, 7 a.m. California, and you please calculate where you are and connect, please. So stay happy and healthy, and all the best. Thank you very much, Chris. It was a very nice talk.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris. Bye-bye.